or books about him in the library. And Mansa Musa, he traveled from Mali all the way through Egypt to Mecca with an entourage of over 1,000 people. And he built mosques on his way and he distributed gold. He was that rich. And he brought the scholars with him, about 1,000. On his way back to his country, he brought with him scholars from Egypt, from Azhar, and they were brought to teach Arabic and Quran to the Muslim population in Mali. So Mansa Musa is a famous story that he was rich. He shared his wealth. And there's a book Dr. Sulaiman Nadwi has written out of India that shows the history of the Bermuda Triangle. As we famously know about the Bermuda Triangle, Mansa Musa sent 1,000 ships out of West Africa to discover the Americas. And the ships were sunk in the Bermuda Triangle, except one was saved, and it went back and it reported to Mansa Musa on his way from the Hajj. Mansa Musa doubled up on the entourage or on the cargo and sent a second delegation to this part of the world. And they were able to settle nicely in the Americas and in Brazil, in a place called Bahia in Brazil. They settled and established the Islamic Caliphate of Mansa Musa in Bahia in Brazil. And even in certain West Indian islands until today, if you travel, like in St. Kitts, for example, I saw in the museum, they had photographs of slaves that were wearing the hijab, and there was also Arabic documents there. In Guyana, the famous Imam Kafi, when he won the revolution against the Dutch from a man called Van Hogem, he said to his followers, we have to pray in gratitude. And he set himself up to pray the prayer of Jummah. In the document, it's written that he prayed the Friday prayer and he bowed. He prayed the Friday prayer and he bowed. Only Muslims pray on the Friday and we bow. And even when Columbus arrived in this part of the world, he came to an island called San Salvador, which he claimed to be the savior. It is written in the books that the people of that island came and bowed to Columbus. Those people did not bow to Columbus. They were bowing to Allah. They were bowing to Allah and to God, because that's how Muslims, they pray. We prostrate on the ground and we bow. Why would they want to bow to someone that came to conquer them? Now, this was the atrocious conditions of which the slaves lived. If you look at that, why would someone want to have the shackles around his neck and his mouth he cannot speak, he cannot communicate, he cannot complain, he cannot move. Whenever the slaves they did not obey the master, they did not work, they tried to learn the Quran, they tried to pray, they tried to escape, they were beaten, they were shackled. These were the atrocious things that they had to go through. And if you remember Bilal that accepted Islam from Ethiopia, he too, as a slave, was beaten, and he was dragged on the hot sand, and in the night, the red ambers were thrown on his back, and he was beaten, and he would cry, Allah, Allah. He would say, Ahad, Ahad, that I believe in one God, and I will not give up believing in one God. The slaves went through similar things on their journey to freedom. I said about clothing, cotton. Cotton is a famous clothing that Muslims wear. You see all the children who are wearing white hijab. And there are certain pictures to show that the Muslim women among the slaves, they wore cotton as their clothing, as well as covering their hair. For a long time, it was a tradition among us. I remember when I was in Grenada, I met an older woman there in the house, in the village, and she was wearing something like this. And she also told me that they make a certain dish from West Africa, which West African Muslims usually make. It's kind of sweet, what we call halwa or shirini or sirni. This is the dress of West Africans, Muslims, so we can understand there was a similarity in the dressing. They would order the cloth, and even the Quran, upon abolition of slavery, they had collected their monies that they had saved. And the first thing the slaves in America did was that they sent to buy 150 copies of the Quran. When the ships came from West Africa, they bought cotton, and they bought copies of the Quran to be shared among them. Now they were free to read. Now, isn't this very poignant and very telling to see that she is wearing the headscarf? This is a photograph of Harriet Tubman. She's called the Little Moses, and it is her story that I was referring to. She brought slaves out of the plantations of America into Canada safely, called the Underground Railroad. So Canada has always been a haven for immigrants and refugees. We are proud in our history that people have come here and have sought refuge from oppression and discrimination. And Harriet Tubman we have that heritage and that history to go with. Little Moses, as we know, Moses brought his children, Musa alayhi salam as we call him, he brought the children of Israel out of Egypt to the promised land, and she was called the Little Moses. Now this Mahmud Yaro, like many other Arabic names of the slaves, they had to change the names to Michael or some other name to keep themselves safe in secret. But the original names were recorded like Abu Bakr and Umar and Muhammad. Now Mahmud is really Muhammad. If you look at the French, they do not say Muhammad, they say Mahomet. Mahomet. So Mahmud was really Muhammad, and look at him, the way he's dressed. You can see that there's some kind of a resemblance to the way Muslims were dressed and still dressed in West Africa. He was living in the States, in the USA, and there was a documentary to show about his history as well. Someone has written a book about his history in the States. What's her name? She has written the book, Diallo, Dr. Diallo. She has written a book about the history of the slaves in America, the Muslim slaves in America. This is the ship that the slaves were held in, and you know, if you go on a cruise, you have much more space. If you find an airplane, if you travel with your families, you know, there's much more space. They were all crowded here, and they had to travel for months in the turbulent Atlantic Ocean, less water, drinking water, less food. Many times they died or they jumped overboard, and they had to survive the cruel conditions. Now food. As we know that Muslims, we eat halal food. We do not eat blood, we do not eat pork, we do not eat meat that Allah's name has not been called upon, etc. There are many verses of the Quran that refers to this. And Muslims, sometimes they may not be best of practicing Muslims, but they're very particular about halal and halal cuisine. This is something that was known among the slaves, that they refused to eat the pork that was offered to them. And the sweets that we found, that the sweets and some of the food that they eat, we find that it is from West Africa. As a matter of fact, there are certain dishes in the Caribbean. And in New Orleans, even when they have their festivals every year, you can look into some of the foods that comes back to West Africa. Things like yam and cassava and plantain, right? And dasheen and other forms of what we call tubers or ground provisions. These came from West Africa and are still used until today. These were the slaves and their children. You could see the deplorable conditions that they lived in. We know that the abolition of slavery was fought by the famous Britisher Wilberforce. Wilberforce has a very interesting story. That is, he was a famous young politician in England, and he was asked by coming from a church background to present the case of the abolition of slavery. And he was not popular when he did that, but he stood his grounds, and he got on board a number of other politicians, and he had formulated a group of, I think, 7 or 8 church representatives to do the bidding. And eventually there was the abolition of slavery in 1838. However, in Islam we know that slavery was abolished by 6 verses of the Quran. There are 6 revealed verses of the Quran that ask us to prohibit and to abolish and to bring an end to slavery, because slavery did exist in the time of pre-Islam, and even during the time of Islam, and even among the Indians and the Africans, and so many nations there are about 12 million slaves in the world until today, and we have to do something about that. Slavery still exists in the world. Human slaves, sex slaves, slaves that are held in captivity to work as immigrant workers, illegal workers, etc., etc. So that's a human dignity that we're taking away from someone. And there was a famous statement by one of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, who was a leader in Egypt, Sa'd bin Abi Waqqas. When someone had hit a slave, he said to him that you have no permission to hit someone and to strike someone that Allah has made freed. Right? You have no right to ill-treat and to beat and to be unjust and to oppress a slave when Allah has made them free. You should free them. So that's a very important thing. The Prophet Muhammad, on whom be peace, he says, whatever you eat, you feed them from that. Whatever you wear that from that. And free them. As a matter of fact, when you free them, that's an act of virtue and blessing in Islam. So believing in the oneness of God. We know that Malcolm X and others have brought back a movement to this part of the world to go back to Islam and to go back to the oneness of Allah and to go back to the practices of Hajj. Malcolm X himself has been an icon in that. He went to the pilgrimage to Mecca. There has been a movement. People have accepted Islam, recognizing that their roots was Islamic from the black community over the years. It's iconic, and it's a very a strong message for us. That is, whatever may be our tradition, whatever may be our ethnic background, our culture, we are indebted to the slaves and for their fight for freedom. We're indebted to Malcolm X and Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King and the likes who have fought in the civil rights movement for our freedom, because we couldn't be here in this part of the world. We couldn't be free. We couldn't be people who could express ourselves and practice our faith. We couldn't do what we are doing. Rather, we understand that there was a history behind this of colonialism, and the people have done what they have done to make our lives better for who we are today. Those are the pictures of the slaves, how their backs were striped at, and that's something similar. Bilal and many of the slaves, Ammar bin Yasir and others, that they faced when they were living in the time of Islam. As a matter of fact, Bilal was not the only one, black, that came from Ethiopia. We know that he was an emissary, he was a diplomat, that he came from West Africa, from Ethiopia. But 1/3 of the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, whom be peace, they came from Africa. As a matter of fact, Saudi Arabia is in the continent of Africa. And one of the foster mothers of the Prophet Muhammad was black. She was African. She was Ayman. Barakah was her name. And one of the wives of the Prophet Muhammad, whom be peace, her name was Maryam the Coptic. She was black and she was African, and she came from Egypt. So having our roots in Africa, the cradle of civilization, having our roots in Africa, knowing that the very first tribes in Africa, the Nubian tribe, they hold great history for Islam until today in Sudan, the share between Sudan and Egypt in the Nile. It's something that we are proud about, because we know that they made great in the history of civilization. They were not dummies. They were not people who live in Timbuktu, did not do anything. They came from a civilization. Egypt is a civilization. Sudan is a civilization. West Africa, Timbuktu, they are a civilization. Spain and the Andalusia is a civilization. And the Muslims, they came from that part of the world. This is another Ayyub al-Sulaiman. His name was Job bin Solomon. We know Job in Arabic is, according to the Bible, is a prophet, and the Arabic for that in the Quran is Ayyub. And we know Sulaiman, the Arabic is the Arabic for Solomon. And we know that Ben in Arabic means son of. And that's how the Arabs and the Muslims would name their children, to show the lineage of who is the father and who's the grandfather and who's the ancestors. So Ayyub bin Sulaiman is it. Prince among slaves. Right? That's the, as I said earlier, that's the movie. And that's another, if you look at that picture there with the turban and the beard, it's very, very much, you know, the traditional picture of Muslims from that part of the world. And they would hang something around the necks. You know that Muslims, they like to hang something around the necks. That could be the Quran that is held in a locket around the necks. And that's the script that is there. I was fortunate enough to see this picture at the City Hall, Toronto City Hall, many years ago in one of my research they were doing on Black History Month. I have collaborated with many Black History presentations and in academics and in the city and in different circles. And this is my passion over the years, to talk about Black History Month and to show the Muslim perspective. And it's important because once you know your identity, as Bob Marley said, once you know your history, you know your identity. Once you know your identity, you know where you're from or where you're going, you'll be proud of yourself. You will not fall prey to people judging you, to people calling you names, to people saying that you cannot do anything for yourself, that you have no history, you have no civilization to rely on. No, you came from scientists. You came from leaders. In Jamaica, when I was there, I researched in a place called Trilani Town. There is a spot called Juman Hole among the mountains in Trilani Town. And the reason it's called Juman Hole is because Jummah Salat was performed in that hole, in that